Colorado. I think I've met a lot of you at GRVs before, so hi again. So yeah, we're going to talk about game rule violations and backups. And in a little bit, when I get to the point that actually has pictures of cards on it, I'm going to need some volunteer in the back of the room to experiment with the light switches so that they will go down the front. So not yet, but when that happens, if lights start changing, that's why. All right, so game rule violations. I guess if you can go ahead and turn them down a little bit. Try it anyway, see what happens.
I don't know about the chandelier.
It's smooth lighting. All right. So, game rule violations, as I think most of us know, they basically cover everything that's not covered by gameplay errors. It's a majority of situations where a player makes a mistake in the game and doesn't really do the procedures correctly. Most of the judge calls that we have tend to be game rule violations. And so, a couple things to think or remember about these are that they, while usually are because of one person, it's happened publicly where both players can see what's happening, and it's important to note that both players are expected to be aware of the game state. I've had some really interesting judge calls where a player, lets their opponent does something that is really crazy and broken. They let it happen because the rules weren't correct, and then they get upset when the ruling happens because you tell them, well, too much time has passed, we're keeping this as it is. Like, you can't let them get away with that, and well, you, sir, actually let your opponent get away with it. So the idea is both players are expected to know what's happening in the game. And anytime something happens where the opponent does not have the ability to verify the legality, so let's say you tutor, mystical tutor for something and put it in your hand without actually showing what it was. Why are you shaking your head?
Because mystical tutor doesn't put it in your hand, it puts it on top of the wall.
Sure. I skipped the step of hand drawing. Yeah. When that happens, there was no way for the opponent to know that you actually got a legal target, and so these are situations where you can actually upgrade the penalty. There are situations where something can happen, but let's say you only have one card in hand, where you might be able to not actually upgrade the penalty, and you would actually reveal that information if possible. So when we have game rule violations, it's really tempting to just fix these. Like just to go in and say, hey, we have this issue, I want to fix it, and that's usually the wrong thing to do. We want to make sure that no matter how much you say this isn't really going to affect the game if I make this tiny change here, we need to make sure that all of the fixes and ways we handle things are consistent throughout the judging experience for players, whether they're judging or playing in a Grand Prix in Chicago or a local tournament in Denver or whatever it is. We want to make sure they have that same experience and rules are consistent. So we can't simply just fix the error. The choice, for the most part, is to leave the game state as it is, or back up the game state to the point of error. So backups. So if the backup is, or if the error is discovered within a reasonable time frame, and it's not going to significantly disrupt the game state, then you can get if you're at a bigger tournament, you can get permission from the head judge to back up. Of course, if you're the only judge, you can give yourself that permission. But remember, it's really important if you're especially at Grand Prix, if you think, hey, this should be backed up, I know I can do it, go find someone who has the ability to give you that permission, whether it's a level 3 that they said they can do it, or the head judges, or whatever it is. You need to make sure you have that permission and not just doing it on the floor on your own without that. So every time there is a decision point in the game, it makes it more difficult to back up. If you think about if there's a decision made and then another decision made and another decision made, each one of those doesn't just like make it 3 times harder to back up. It actually exponentially makes it harder because there's more information known to the players and there's more factors that could change. So the more decision points that have passed, the less likely we are to actually back up. And if you do back up, you want to make sure you're backing up to the point of error. So we're not just going to say, well, I know this would happen, I would change this one factor and make that switch. You actually have to back up to that point of error, which can include untapping lands that were used to cast something that was an illegal target. It can include moving things that went to different zones. What happens if someone had incorrectly drew a card and it wasn't a drawing your cards error, but because of the gameplay error? And you want to back that up, what do you do? Good? Does it, yeah, so just take any, the key word there is there's a random card from their hand, not the one that they tell you, hey, just drew this card, and I know I just drew this card.
Well, one thing that's really important on that is it's not just, even if you as the judge were watching the match and you saw what card it is, it still needs to be a random in order to have consistency, even though in that case you could put the known card back. It still needs to be random even if you as the judge know. And that also applies to the situation where you're talking about upgrading if the opponent doesn't know. Even if you as the judge saw the right type of card got put in hand, if the opponent doesn't have a way to verify, you still upgrade that. What you as the judge happen to see in a match doesn't affect how you fix game violations.
Right, the key is that it's, is that if you see it, you can't use that as the evidence of saying, hey, I know he just drew this card. But if it was a card that was known somehow because they revealed the top card of the library, then you know which one was the one who was drawing.
And to add to that, in terms of the card that's actually known, we have to be able to positively identify it rather than being able to identify it by elimination. So if the Taxi Pro was played last turn, it's like, well, I know these 5 cards are in his hand and he has 6, so it must be the other one. That's not good enough to identify what the card was. You still have to do it in the given fix rather than extrapolating and figuring out which the card was.
And again, when we back up, we're backing up everything or nothing at all. So this means that we're not just making up our own partial fixes to try to figure out how to back things up. Of course, there are a couple exceptions to that rule. Who can tell me what those exceptions are? Okay, wrong zone. Discarding something, sure. Or well, discarding. Add to that, just discarding randomly, or forgetting to discard. Yeah. Choice made on pithing needle, those kind of things. Yeah.
Steps that were skipped, like untap or draw.
Well, drawing a card is definitely one. The steps might kind of be situational, depending on exactly what you mean by that in the situation. But I think I know what you're saying there. And there are these exceptions. So one was the illegal choice that was made. The forgetting to draw cards also includes discarding cards and forgetting to return cards from your hand to another zone. An object being in the wrong zone, and if attacker or blocker order was not declared. Those are the 4 exceptions. So if there's the legal choice, if a player made an illegal choice for a static ability that generates a continuous effect and it's still on the battlefield, that player now makes a legal choice. If the player forgot to draw, to discard, or to return cards from their hand to another zone, they do so. If an object was changing zones and was put into the wrong zone, and the identity of that object was known to all players, and it can be moved without disrupting the state of the game, then you put it in the correct zone. One thing about this one is it was somewhat recently changed. This used to also have a within a turn of the era, which is no longer there, which makes some significant changes in a couple rulings. And then the last one was attacking and blocking order. If that had not been declared, then the appropriate player is going to actually order those. So now we're going to get into the fun part, which is some situations of whether you're actually going to back up or not back up. So hopefully these are somewhat visible. If not, I'll read the cards. But basically, we have a Doom Blade, which destroys target non-black creature, that targeted a Phyrexian Obliterator. During Angela's combat step, we're now in Angela's second main phase. So what are you going to do if you're the judge called to this situation? Great.
Why would the change occur during the combat?
Yes, let's all change it did occur during combat.
Well, it's rather relevant to know when during her combat stuff was the two-flag attack.
Sure. So she attacked with a Phyrexian Obliterator, only the Phyrexian Obliterator. No other creatures on the battlefield. Doomblade was right. No combat damage happened. Doomblade happened in that combat step, killing it, and there was no damage there. So, the situation that you know I'm get at. And so what's the answer to the question that's supposed to have been asked then? Okay, so if you're going to back it up, what would you do? And then combat begins again, right? And what if, let's say, this happened 2 turns ago? No backups? All right.
What happened during this?
Yeah.
Cards were drawn. Draw go.
So it was draw go for 2 turns?
Draw go for 2 turns.
I would still back that up, yes.
Would anybody not back up and draw go for 2 turns?
Too much information.
Depends on how many cards you're taking. I think
Okay.
players don't have any cards, they can back it up, but if both players have a group of cards, that's the decision to make.
I find it's really hard to justify backing up more than 1 turn if there have been cards drawn, just because of the information that's going to be known past that point. So I don't, the 2 turns I would definitely not back up.
Also, their decisions to attack or not to attack may have changed if that was on the battlefield, and so even if they said draw go, they might not have said draw go, and there may have been other things that happened. That would have happened.
Now, specifically in this example, the person literally turned it off and attack, correct?
Yes, if the Doomblade was cast after the attack was declared, that's where you stopped.
Or whenever the Dublade was cast.
They return right to the point where that action is taking place. All right, so you're at a Grand Prix. You walk by a table and you see a Geist of St. Traft with a mind control on it. So at this point, what do? Do you keep walking or do you not keep walking? It's possible.
So,
Is there multiple vaults in the graveyard?
Yeah.
the first thing I do is I stop and I look at the game in more detail to try and see if there's any obvious reason that it happened, something that made it lose hexproof or.
And once you come to the conclusion that there is no obvious reason that that should have happened.
Then I will ask the players how that may have happened.
Okay. So while investigating, you find that the mind control was cast while it's still at hexproof, and that the player who controlled the Geist has attacked with it for at least 2 turns.
I don't think you can back it up with apply state-based actions at that point.
So I agree, you're definitely not backing it up. And the question is, do you apply state-based actions? And if you do,
So, yes,
that's right, the game state is perfectly legal right now because it has hexproof, not shroud. So the mind control.
Well, Just want protection.
Yes. So it has the ability to stay on the creature and nothing would change. With that in mind, though, let's say the situation was a controlled instincts, which says it says enchant red or green creature. So if that's a situation, once you get to state-based actions, what happens? Because it is an illegal target. There's another hand up here. Does that get answered, or are we? All right, so let's say that Angie has a Rune Halo in play, and Nancy casts and attacks a Strangler Geist. During the attack step, Angie realizes that she somehow managed to play Rune Halo without naming a card. It's been 3 turns since the Rune Halo was cast. So you're called to the table, and the opponent say, that's the situation, what do you do? Okay. And makes a choice now, so we're not going to back up to when it was played. And what lets us have the ability to do that?
It's a continuous.
The partial
It was
fix.
one of those 4 partial fixes we went through. So Angie will be able to make that choice, and if she wanted to, could she say that Strangleroot Geist was the card? In this situation, I would also have questions with Angie of why she played this without naming a card. Seems interesting, but yeah. All right, so let's say that Arthur has a Jace in play, Jace the Mind Sculptor. He uses the Brainstorm ability. So he draws 3 cards and does not put 2 of them back on top of his library. The next turn, he ends up brainstorming again and does put 2 back. The next turn, he does put 2 back, and the player's like, wait a second, you forgot to put 2 back before, and they call the judge over. So what's going to happen in this situation?
Take 2, well, you'd explain what's going on and say that because that you can't back up because of the information there's too much information that's been revealed to the player, but the player needs to put 2 random cards from their hand shuffled back into the library.
So I'm definitely agreeing that the backup, too much has happened for you to back up to the point of error. Any other thoughts on that fix? Who I think, would your hand up first? Okay. All right, go for it.
On this particular one, couldn't you get an argument for upgrading the GRV
For drawing extra cards? Any thoughts on that?
Told to draw 3 cards and he did so.
So it's not that extra cards were in his hand because of drawing the extras. He drew the right number, just didn't finish the resolving part of that, which is the discard of that effect. Okay, so we have that possibility on the table. Any others?
Not really.
Not really. Or leave game state is, that's another one. And your hand's been up for a while.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, you don't put random cards back to the situation because we're not applying the fix for drawing extra cards because that isn't what happened. Cards should have been put back according to specific instructions and they weren't, so the player now puts 2 cards of their choice from their hand back on top of their library.
So we made a decision that we're not backing up. And now we're at the point of, is there a partial fix we can apply, or is there a, there is, okay, that's what you're gonna say there?
Yeah.
Right, so it's that partial fix that said if cards were in hand, you should have gone to a different zone, they use them now. So the player, Arthur, is now going to discard 2 cards. Sorry, I'll put 2 cards back in his library. Again, these words keep getting to me, so.
If I can alter the scenario just a little, what if he has no cards left in his hand because they were landing in instances of the player? What do you do then?
Joss?
No cards in hand.
Well, it's no different if you have no cards in hand and something instructs you to put cards on top of your library. You can't do it, so you don't. And the same thing happened here. Of course, I'd investigate to make sure that you're cheating, because that's a huge advantage to play this game.
Right.
He's going to see quite a few extra cards that are not having it. Ultimately, you just instruct the player to put some cards of his choice on top of his library. If he has none, only one.
We mentioned that most of these errors are things that the opponent and the player should be able to notice are happening. This definitely is one of those. And it's not something we're going to say, well, you should have put 2 cards on top of your library, so the next 2 cards you draw just have to go back on top of your library. It's not going to happen. So you're right. It's the player is instructed to discard or put 2 cards on top of their library. If they only have 0 or 1 cards in their hand, they still follow those instructions as much as they can. Is that a hand up or just judging? All right, so we have a mind lock orb in play. Mind lock orb says players can't search libraries. We have a verdict catacombs that Andrew uses, and he searches for a forest and puts that forest into play. Once the forest is in play, the players say, wait a second, that could not have happened. Call the judge over, what do you do?
You just back up to where the fetch at the graveyard, and then you just don't search, because you can still crack fetch it without searching the library.
So it's saying that we realize it's something that's easy to back up.
Yep.
So you're going to take the forest, shuffle it back in. When you back up, which point are we going to? So I think you said that you're going to have the verdict catacombs in the graveyard. The other option is the verdict catacombs is in play. So is anybody who would leave verdict catacombs in play? Excellent. So that's correct. It goes to the graveyard because the sacrifice of it is completely illegal, a legal action, but the searching is not a legal action. So let's say instead of Mind Lock Orb, we had a Blood Moon in play. The same thing happens, the player goes through and searches the library for a forest, puts it in play, they realize, wait, you couldn't do that. What happens here?
Can't you just back it up to the point that the Virgin Catacombs was in play? They committed an illegal action in the first place. Your mountain doesn't sacrifice for anything with the tap, so they never should have put it in the graveyard to go get the forest. Nothing else has changed. You just put the forest back in, put the forest back in play. It's a mountain. Stop being bad in the game.
And now adding that is the end of every judge calling it. But yeah, the difference is with the Blood Moon, it means that the illegal action was sacrificing the Verdant Catacombs in the first place. With the Mind Lock Orb in play, the illegal action was searching, but the sacrifice was still legal, and that's the difference there. All right, so this is the fun one. We've got, and I stole this one, Steven Wenger did a presentation on GRVs and Backups, so if you've been to that one, then you already know the answer to this. But Arthur has a Green Sun Zenith, cast it with X equals 4. He goes and fetches a Hellrider and puts the Green Sun Zenith into his graveyard. He attacks. There's 1 damage taken from Hellrider. Hellrider's blocked with an Oculus. It dies. His opponent draws a card. Then his opponent casts Doomblade on the Hellrider. Then they take a look at Green Sun Zenith and realize that they made a big mistake in the way that card was supposed to be played. Green Sun Zenith is supposed to only search for a green creature, and it's supposed to be shuffled into the library. So what do we do here? Yes.
Just game loss. Leave the game state where it's at.
Leave everything exactly as it is.
Issue the appropriate penalties around for failure to maintain, but I wouldn't change anything because there's so many broken pieces here.
Okay. Okay. So is there anybody who would back this situation up? Okay, a couple.
I might. I mean, you have to consider, is it better to leave the game state as is, or is it better, like, is it a worse situation if we back up and we know that there's a Doomblade? You know, backing up through combat, that's not that big of a deal because the decisions will be different anyway if the Hellrider is on the battlefield. So is knowing a Doomblade that much worse than leaving a Hellrider that shouldn't be on the battlefield on the battlefield?
There's also the drop.
There's also a card.
The Doomblade could have possibly been the card drawn from Oculus, or could have already been in the hand.
Oh, Oculus draws a card when it dies?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I didn't, yeah, I missed the draw.
So I would leave it as it is and do state-based actions, which would shuffle Green Sun Zenith into the library.
It's not a state-based section.
So
But you can do a partial fix because it was a card going to one zone that went to the wrong zone. It should have gone in the library and rolled.
So the partial fix is that the Green Sun Zenith is in the wrong zone and needs to be in the right zone, so we can definitely shuffle that into play. I wouldn't recommend backing up mostly because of the card drawing. It's the part that makes it, solidifies it for the not backing up part for me at least. And then the everything else stays as it is because there's been a lot that's happened and a lot of decision points. I would still not back that one up. I could see an argument possibly for doing it, but I would not.
I would say if there wasn't a card draw, I might consider backing this up, but with the card draw, yeah, that's a throw. Okay.
If you would back it up without the card draw, if the card drawn is the only card.
Yeah, I think that's what the question
Yeah.
is. So if the Oculus player controls, has no card in hand and draws the Doomblade and casts it, then a backup is kind of fine there.
It's possible, but as he just pointed out, still that's now giving the information that the top card's a Doomblade. If you do back up, the player is now going to possibly search for something other than that. Something with a black
Well, I
card.
mean, if you back up, aren't you gonna randomize the library so that the top card isn't known because now they've seen a card?
Why would you randomize the
But
library?
then you're changing the law.
Because you've seen a card that you're not supposed to see and the top card in your library should be known.
It's not us.
Your coin shows you a card.
Nothing.
You mean, so,
Yeah.
yeah, you can rent the library.
What
But
are
they
the backing up
fix the drawing
guidelines?
for having that.
But now, because you're doing that, you know, that creates a whole bunch of other things that you're doing, which is why even if you hold
Because of all those
you
situations.
don't want to back up.
But if we were to back up, I don't see why we ever randomize the Doomblade player's library.
Yeah, I think it would end up on top, because it's a random card and going on top of the library, because it was a card that was drawn.
Yeah, but
And it fixed
the
that
card that was
separately.
legally drawn at the time. So you're just putting a random card from.
And there's nothing in the backup guidelines that would advocate randomized libraries.
Right.
I think this is one, I don't think through the drawn card, you're gonna want to back up anyway, so.
Right. Yeah, because of everything that, the discussion that just happened, I think is a good reason as to why backing up here is not really the recommended action, because there's too many different variables and decision points made that are going to cause that. Like I said, it's that number of decision points and what those are that really affect whether you should back up or not.
So assuming that I had actually said partial fix instead of state-based actions, you would shuffle the Green Sun Zenith into their library.
Right, the partial.
Yeah,
fix
that
is
would be
pretty
all you
simple.
do.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so this one we have a sort of feast and famine. What this says is that whenever a equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, that player discards a card, and you untap all lands that you control. So Alex has a creature with sort of feast and famine on it. He attacks. He deals combat damage. Norm discards a card, but Alex does not untap his lands. At the end step, Norm casts a spell and it resolves. Alex ends his turn, Norm goes to his turn and draws a card. At this point, Alex realizes he did not untap his lands. Calls the judge over. So what's going to happen in this situation? So you basically partially resolved the sort of feast and famine. Any thoughts? Bigger?
So, I don't believe you can actually partially resolve a trigger. Because he has acknowledged the fact that the trigger has happened and a discard has happened, you need to resolve the entire trigger. So I am assuming you just, the fix here is just untap the lands and proceed.
Alright, so I have one thought of untapping the lands right now. Luke?
So yeah, it's right that you're not partially resolving the trigger, but untapping the lands isn't one of the partial fixes. So you're either backing up to where the trigger is on the stack, backing up to the resolution of the trigger and resolving the trigger correctly, or you're letting it stand. The card was discarded. If the lands had been untapped and the card hadn't been discarded, that would be a
mistrigger.
No, it's not a mistrigger.
So if he untaps
GRV,
his land.
yeah.
It's a GRV.
He demonstrated awareness of the trigger by.
Because it's one single trigger, not two, doing one of it, not the other, isn't a mistrigger, it's a GRV.
But if you untap lands and not discarding them, you can apply the partial fix with him to discard.
So that's the next question, part B. We're A right now. So A is where the situation where he did not untap but did discard.
Yeah, you're either backing up or you're leaving it as is.
So are you going to back up or are you going to leave it as is?
Barring any other reason not to back up, I'm backing up.
Yeah, well, it
It
depends
was
what spell he
cast
casts.
the spell and it results within a spell that said draw 3 cards, or was it a spell that said, you know, destroy
Was it a spell that showed his library?
Was it, yeah.
If the spell was a draw cards,
Yeah,
if the spell was a
that
shuffle his library,
that's-
I'm gonna back up, choosing a card that isn't the card that he cast, would randomly back on top of his library, back up to the spell that he casts, and just go back into combat with the trigger.
If that is a fix that you apply, if you decide to back up there, I don't think you can do the option of not choosing the spell in his hand. You just have to randomize the hand, so you could possibly.
Oh, well, no.
Well, it's not in his hand. It wouldn't be in his hand at that point.
It can't be the
Yeah,
spell that you cast because it's not necessary.
So you put a card back on top of it, you literally just go.
You mean the one you just read?
And
Sorry.
then,
Yeah.
and then put the spell that he cast back into his hand.
That's the one he was talking about. I missed that too. So we have a couple people advocating backing up and a couple not. I don't know whose hand was first. I think whatever Jason was.
Wouldn't this just be a non-detrimental trigger that was missed and you do nothing for it because
So it was
there-
not a
there-
trigger, because what happened is, what the trigger says is that your opponent discards a card and you untap your lands. Those are
Right.
both the same, in the same trigger. And part of it happened and part didn't. So it's actually not, if he had not done either of those things, then it is a mistrigger. But because one of those things happened, it's not going to be a mistrigger.
So, I mean, I don't see how you can back up because the problem is it was supposed to untap his lands, which then means he could have responded to whatever spell that Norm cast at the time. And so it would really change a lot of the game state to back up.
Which is why I say it depends on what spell was
Yeah, it
cast.
definitely depends on what spell it is.
So if there was no spell cast, regardless of what spell that was, or if there was no spell cast, I think it's a lot easier to say, yeah, this is a backup. And I would agree that it does depend on what spell is cast as far as whether you would or not. I had spent about 10 minutes, I guess, talking with Steven on this one, and he was pretty advocate about the fact that you would never back this one up. Which I'm not 100% sure that's the same call I'd make, because I would kind of know which was cast as well. So, yeah.
So I recently read the IPG, and on this particular case, I wouldn't back up. However, I would definitely call point to an investigation. Like, there's an example right in a sporting conduct cheating of a player notices that his opponent resolved playing half the trigger ability of sort of piece of ground and decides to not call attention to the error. That's a great example of sporting conduct cheating.
Right.
Yeah.
So that specific example that you're showing is pretty much,
You told me
it's a
about
great
that.
point to do an investigation on
Yes.
why they didn't call it. I assume we're treating, I assume we're treating these scenarios like.
Right, I did need that disclaimer first of we're going to assume that, of course, anytime you have these kind of errors, you are going to wonder if there's cheating involved. Definitely going to have that discussion. So we're going to assume that there was no cheating for these, for the whole backup.
But one real important point on this particular scenario is that cheating requires the player to do something they know they are not supposed to do. If the player misunderstood the mistrigger policy and thought they were allowed, intentionally didn't remind their opponent not to untap the land because they thought that was a thing they were allowed to do, that isn't cheating. Even though doing it, while they know they weren't allowed to do it, is cheating, because they misunderstood the mistrigger policy and were very open and honest that I noticed, I did my part, I didn't think I had to remind him to do his. That is not cheating. It is for cheating.
Cheating requires intent.
If you decide not to back up, you're not going to tap
It-
land. Because
Cheating actually specifically requires.
This specific example is part of my change.
So the question is, why can't we just, if we decide not to back up, just untap those lands? And the answer is because we have this list of partial fixes that we can take, and untapping is not one of them. The partial fixes, they missed it the other way, which I forget, I think you mentioned it, one of you guys.
It was between the.
Okay, mentioned that if it was the other way where they forgot to discard but did untap, that is a partial fix you're going to have to do, you're going to have to discard now. So in the interest of time, we're going to skip, oh, this one's kind of fun. So we've got a duress cast on dead. The duress gets a primeval titan into the graveyard, which is where the error is because you can't get the creature. The primeval titan is then reanimated. Library is searched for 2 lands. There's a concordant crossroads in place so that it has haste. It attacks, searches for 2 lands, and then the player realizes you could not have duressed that. So, this one is a fun one, but I'm going to fast track the discussion because I want to get to the last one. Where the answer here is going to be that you are obviously not backing up because there's an event that's going to have happened here. And there is nothing in the wrong zone. And so there's actually going to be no remedy for this one. They're going to leave the game state as it is. From that reaction, I think there are a couple that disagree with me, so we can talk about it later afterwards. But let's see. So this one is just that we've had a goblin arsonist that attacks, is not blocked, and they play a Storm Blood Berserker without putting counters on it. So they don't do the Bloodthirst counter for that. In the next attack phase, they decide to block and realize, wait a second, this should have had 2 counters on it. So you are not going to back up. Is it a mistrigger?
No.
No.
Why is it not a mistrigger?
Not a trigger.
Even though Bloodthirst does say their reminder text looks an awful lot like a trigger, it begins with if, it's actually a replacement effect, which is a good thing to know. So this actually happened at a, yeah, I guess you were there. This actually happened at a, was it some IQ super something. Underworld Cerebus was in play. It died, and its text reads, when it dies, you exile it, you return all cards from, all creature cards from each player's graveyard to their hand. Well, the players return all cards from the graveyard into play. And I don't remember exactly what they were, but when I walked over to the board, it looked something like this. All the landscape.
No fix.
So there were a whole lot of into the battlefield triggers. There were scries, there were draws, there were all sorts of things. And I don't think there's any question here as to whether or not you're backing this up, because you're not. But we do have a significant number of cards that are in the wrong zone. Do you apply that partial fix?
How confident are both players in exactly what cards?
If the players can 100% tell you these are the 27 creatures that just came from the graveyard,
Did they already resolve triggers?
they resolved all the beneficial triggers.
I'm not doing anything from any zone. This is way too much.
Good fight.
Good luck, you 2 idiots. You just screwed them up horribly.
The players deserve each other.
So, yes, legally married.
Oh, if it doesn't come from
this to you.
So the interesting part about this is, my thought is you're never going to back this up ever, because so much has happened. You're never going to even do the partial fix, because it seems like it would disrupt a lot of the game going on, etc. That's what I thought 100% certainty this morning, and then as I was driving down here, I was messaging Steven back and forth. And for a little while, we managed to. Yes, no, I was in the passenger. So Steven Zwinger managed to convince me that he would actually return the cards to the correct zone, which I'm still not sure I agree with, but was a really interesting one. I talked to Jeremy this morning, and Jeremy's thought was, if you can 100% identify every single card, then you might be able to do the partial fix. If there's even a possible question on one of those cards, there's no way you do any partial fix here. But the fact of this is a situation that actually happened and kind of blew my mind when I walked over to the table. Yes.
So you already searched with Primeval Titan and tried with this Temple of Melody.
There's no back.
And Oracle.
Every one of those cards is
At
that point, isn't moving the creatures to the graveyard just as horrible a solution as letting these 2 morons finish their game? You're way too late to fix this. Their libraries are out of order, they've got extra lands on the battlefield.
Supposed to tell them stop being sad and not.
Yes. You walk up to the table, you say that, and you leave, and that's it. So with that in mind, we're now done with this session. We're out of time, so thanks for joining our backups and GRVs. I'm going to put the lights back on.